Before this video begins, I just want to remind you that I'm now partnered with Gamersupps, and you can save 10% off your regular Gamersupps purchase by using my code on screen now, or clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. I've been a big fan of their caffeinated flavors, in particular Nuclear Bombsicle, but they also have sleep support drinks in their AFK line that I also think are delicious. And if you haven't heard yet, going until 2 PM EST on October 31st, you can use my code to get free shipping on any order over $50, which might be useful if you want to check out the new waifu cup drop, Holy Sheet. Thank you for supporting the channel every day, and let's get into the video. Welcome, boys and ghouls, to a very special Halloween special. The Five Nights at Freddy's series has always had a unique relationship with this holiday. You see, normally in a FNAF game, what you see is what you get, and it's your job as the player to piece together the story. Everything you see is meant to be used. But, dear viewer, I ask, what if you played FNAF 1 on October 31st? Well, you would be playing the first FNAF game, but now the setting is Halloween themed, which begs the question, is this canon? The same can be done in FNAF 2 and 3, and FNAF 4 has its very own Halloween edition. But despite this, we've never been bothered by seeing these spooky decorations in the office or even the unique animatronics from FNAF 4. Halloween, for all intents and purposes, is non-canon. Or at least, it used to be. Join me as we sit around the campfire and talk about FNAF's bizarre Halloween tie-ins, from the very little to the very big. Let's begin. Originally, the first 3 games had simple Easter eggs, typically placing a pumpkin somewhere in your office. This pumpkin, for all intents and purposes, is consistent across all 3 original FNAF titles. In fact, I'd venture to call it the most consistent character between the 3, and as mentioned, they appear solely if you play these games on Halloween. This pumpkin character would actually appear later on in FNAF 4's Halloween edition, where it would graduate and get its own jump scare. However, I don't believe this pumpkin has any sort of canon name, making it one of the few FNAF characters in the series to kill you, but not have a given name at all, since it only exists as an extension of Jacko Chica. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Is there any other difference between these games? No, and that's oddly the strange part if you ask me, because even though we're playing at a completely different time of year presumably from whenever the events of each game happen, the story itself and the gameplay is entirely unchanged. It asks a lot of questions. For instance, if the story is the same, could these games all just be taking place in October anyway? I mean, I could argue it makes the most sense for FNAF 3 to take place in October since that would be the prime time of year to try and open up a haunted attraction. But does it make sense for FNAF 2 and the original? Well, there's a problem here. You see, both the original game and FNAF 2 have paychecks that tell us that they take place in November, but that's not necessarily true. See, if Freddy Fazbear's is like any job I've worked at, then their pay structure is likely based on a 1 or 2 week basis, starting at the end of a 1 or 2 week period. For this, if we assume Freddy's pays bi-weekly instead of weekly, and this is Mike and Jeremy's first weeks on the job, then it's technically possible for them to have started working in October and they're only getting their first paychecks in November. Which I have to say, a place like Freddy's paying bi-weekly is a little bizarre to me. They definitely strike me as weekly. What this means is that it's entirely possible, or even likely, that all 3 original FNAF games are in fact happening around the Halloween season. So surely the Halloween versions of these 3 might as well be canon, right? Well, there is another problem. These decorations are only in-game on Halloween night, which to me implies that the restaurant is being dressed for the holiday specifically. But you could play through all 5 nights on Halloween, or you could play night 1 on Halloween and then night 2 on November 1st. Or hell, if you want to get real wonky, play night 1 and 2 on Halloween, play night 3 on November 1st, then set your calendar back to Halloween and play nights 4 and 5, meaning that in your playthrough of FNAF 1, it was Halloween for 4 of your 5 nights non-consecutively, and Mike is in a time loop. I guess this is why it's easier to just ignore the Halloween decor entirely, as it really messes up a timeline that didn't need messing up to begin with. So then, how about FNAF 4? Well, FNAF 4 obviously has its Halloween edition, which I'd call the hard mode version of that game because oh my god, do not let Nightmare Mangle into your closet if you want any chance of winning. This version of FNAF 4 replaces a lot of the original game's assets. Nightmare Bonnie becomes Jacko Bonnie, Nightmare Chica becomes Jacko Chica, Nightmare Foxy gets swapped for Nightmare Mangle, Plush Trap gets swapped for Nightmare Balloon Boy, and Nightmare himself gets swapped for Nightmarian. Oddly enough, Freddy himself doesn't get replaced at all, which is a huge missed opportunity if you ask me, but hey, whatever. I guess there'll never be any more Jackos again. Never ever, not one. Hey, stop fading in slowly, we're not there yet. What's most interesting in my opinion is that this Halloween edition does somewhat bleed into the story, as you can see Halloween decorations during the end of night minigames, firmly setting this story in October as well. However, I again have to ask, how canon is this? Scott made it clear way back when that Halloween edition isn't canon, but I mean, if you keep using Nightmarian, I'm gonna keep side-eyeing you when you say that. Regardless, there's not really a lot to talk about here outside of the animatronics themselves, namely where they come from. And that mystery is extremely convoluted because we're still mostly unclear on where these things come from. Are they nightmare gas? Illusion discs? Some sinister third thing? Literal nightmares? There's not a solid enough answer to go off of really, so how can we find out where the bright orange rabbit comes from? Well, I'll just tell you my opinion. I think the Jackos aren't actually derivative of the Nightmare animatronics at all, and by that I mean in lore they're probably unrelated, and I say that simply because we have Jackos of characters who never had Nightmare versions in the first place. So I'm just gonna tuck this aside for now and we'll revisit the idea of the Jackos being their own entities later on. Now we move on to FNAF World, which is where things get kinda gray canon-wise. I'm sure some of you by now have seen that the canonicity of this game has been up for debate lately, so it may be wise for me to ignore it, but I can't. I simply can't. FNAF World is actually one of the most interesting cases of a Halloween event for the series because of how extremely meta it was. And actually, there are 2 Halloween events related to this game. The first is FNAF World Halloween Edition. This was a troll game that introduced the world to Lolzhax, yet another new character introduced for Halloween who we may see return. Lolzhax had apparently leaked FNAF World before it came out, but what we actually got was a reskinned version of one of Scott Cawthon's older games, Fighter Mage Bard. Oddly enough though, while this was a troll game, it would actually bear a lot of similarities to the finished product, namely several of the enemies would make it to the final game, like Tangle, Mad Endo, and Brow Boy. But that was pretty much it for Halloween Edition, just a troll game meant to promote the bigger release of FNAF World. So what about the second FNAF World Halloween event? Well, in version 1.2 of FNAF World, we get a brand new area known as the Halloween Backstage. This was a collection of minigames that introduced a whole new row of playable characters to the game, including Jacko Bonnie and Jacko Chica, as well as Nightmarian. However, it also introduced characters like Chipper, Anim Dude, and Coffee Pot, who are all extremely meta gag characters meant to poke fun at the failure that the original game was. In a sense, the Halloween Backstage wasn't really a Halloween event at all. It was just the final throes of FNAF World lightly coated in a Halloween theme, but that theme was as shallow as a sheet ghost. But that's not to say it wasn't fun. In fact, I love FNAF World and think this update only made the game even better. But the connection to Halloween just isn't really there. Sadly though, that was it for Halloween specific content for the longest time, with Sister Location, Pizza Sim, and UCN skipping out. Mostly, anyway. UCN did include some characters from the Halloween edition of FNAF 4, and that little nugget of info is probably not going to matter later. But sadly, there just wasn't anything new. However, we then received Help Wanted, the first of FNAF's VR titles. And while the base game is of course not really a Halloween-oriented game, it did get DLC entirely devoted to the holiday called Curse of Dreadbear. These minigames were all brand new and were probably among the most impressive and entertaining minigames in the entire Help Wanted package. It came with a new hub world, new animatronics, and a surprising amount of lore. Most prominently, we were introduced to 2 new characters who would end up being recurring, those being Dreadbear and Jacko Foxy. Wait, hold on, I seem to have misplaced my file, so I see, yeah, his name is actually Grim Foxy. I'm gonna fucking kill my Dreadbear is definitely an interesting one, as unlike the majority of characters in Help Wanted, we never saw a definitive real version of this character, since he's original to an in-universe VR game. However, I do actually think there was a real Dreadbear at some point, and I'll explain why later. In this DLC, he mostly exists as our Freddy stand-in, but he does have a dedicated minigame of his own where we get to feel his mushy brain, because he has one. Look at you, so judgmental. Grim Foxy, meanwhile, exists as part of a corn maze minigame that, while scary, I think is pretty easy. The aim of the game is simply not to get caught, although I'll admit it takes some getting used to. Lore-wise, Grim Foxy doesn't have anything either, but visually, he very clearly is a Halloween version of Nightmare Foxy. Same withering, same endoskeleton. My theory as to why Grim Foxy isn't explicitly called Jacko Foxy is because Steel Wool didn't want to make a whole new Foxy model just for this character. That's why, despite the withering matching Nightmare Foxy, you can see his actual head shape is based on Withered Foxy. For all intents and purposes though, this is still Jacko Foxy. Maybe they just switched their names around for fun. So long as we don't see any more Jackos in the future, we'll be fine. Outside of those characters, Curse of Dreadbear also introduced us to Fall Fest, which would go on to be a central focal point of the modern FNAF plot, and tied it into characters like the Aftons pretty heavily through visuals and slight Easter eggs. But what's most important is that from here on out, almost every FNAF game would have some slight Halloween theme to it, as Steel Wool loves bringing their characters back in every game. Although the animatronics themselves don't make an appearance, the Halloween cutouts from Curse of Dreadbear would show up in Security Breach, as well as a ton of Nightmarian plushies whose real purpose is still mostly unknown so far. Then we get to Help Wanted 2 and find ourselves with some lingering Halloweenness in the form of Dreadbear once again. This time he's mostly stationary unless you get too low a score on the Phaser Blast minigames, then he kills you. But new and so far exclusive to this game is Jacko-san. Why is this character Jacko Moon? I mean, personality and voice-wise, I get it, but let's be real, this is Jacko's son. Look at that head, all the sun rays poking out, and not a damn sign of the sleep cap Moon wears. I would comment on the pants as well, but for some reason, Jacko Moon's pants don't look like suns or moons, and he just looks like a bum. That's why I think it's important that despite Jacko Moon clearly being named Moon, it's physically still Sun, because Sun is how Fiona is represented in Secret of the Mimic. In a way, it almost feels like foreshadowing for the next game. And up until Secret of the Mimic receives some form of update, that's it for Halloween-related anything in the main FNAF series of games. However, there is also Special Delivery, which, while it's unavailable now, did have a special Halloween event wherein Plushtrap and Jacko, Bonnie, and Chica were added. I did not play with any of these. Outside of the games though, we still have plenty to talk about. There is of course the FNAF movie, which came out on October 27th, 2023, 5 nights before Halloween. It was Blumhouse's big Halloween release of that year, and ended up being their biggest Halloween opening ever, even surpassing the films named after the holiday. Further than that though, the FNAF movie also made an appearance at Halloween Horror Nights, and I'm definitely not gonna cry myself to sleep about not being able to go. Man, it sucks being poor. Also during October of this year was the Fanta collaboration, where Freddy got to have his face on Fanta's classic orange flavor. This, I think, is still among the crazier collabs the series has ever done, but it's looking like it won't be the last. Now, frankly, I am a little bit worried about mentioning this since apparently some accounts have had their posts taken down, but apparently a certain chicken restaurant will also be collabing with FNAF in the future, and I think that's just funny. Like, simply no other way to put it, that's just funny. And that's not even mentioning the Halloween costumes, the Halloween decoration, or any of the hundreds of other pieces of FNAF merch that'll likely be bought during the season. Hell, I have this Halloween glow-in-the-dark DVD copy of the movie, and it's something I unironically love a whole lot. But I think now it's time to discuss what Halloween means for the actual story of FNAF. Keep in mind that everything you're about to hear is based off of one thing: the idea that the actual holiday, Halloween, has any sort of meaning to the FNAF timeline. If it doesn't, which is likely true, then think of this as just a thought experiment. The rest of you, let's dig into this pile of pumpkin goo. Need to scrape some seeds out of that later. So I've been listing off every unique animatronic associated with Halloween. We of course start with Mr. Pumpkin, but then we get Jacko Bonnie, Jacko Chica, Nightmare Balloon Boy, Nightmare Mangle, and Nightmarian from FNAF 4's Halloween edition. Top that off with Dreadbear, Grim Foxy, and Jacko Moon, who isn't really associated with Halloween directly, but being made a retroactive member of the Jacko gang, I feel obligated to include him. But why have I talked about all these characters? Well, I think it's important to separate the Jackos from the Not-Sos. Chica, Bonnie, Foxy, and Sun are all characters who very visibly have a fire motif going about them, with the idea being that they're hollowed out and orange on the outside like a jack-o'-lantern. And immediately when I think of fire during fall in this franchise, I'm thinking of Fall Fest. Since we know Fazbear Entertainment was most likely present at Fall Fest during the fire that killed Fiona Murray, I think that's what these Jackos could likely represent. But then why the daycare attendant, an animatronic who wouldn't exist until way later in the timeline? Well, because Sun is representative of Fiona herself. That's why I think it's important that despite Jacko's Sun clearly being evil like Moon, it's still Sun. Because Sun is how Fiona is represented in Secret of the Mimic. Likely, the other Jackos are the animatronics who were brought out to the fire but were burned up, leaving some characters better off than others. Notably Dreadbear and Nightmarian, but I'll get to those two soon. First, I want to mention the odd ones out. The characters I could not find any real connection with, and one of them is Nightmare Mangle. That might be unsurprising, as Nightmare Mangle is one of the few FNAF characters to have not returned in any capacity since Steel Wool began developing for the series. Meaning that this character is likely just lore incompatible with Fall Fest, and for that reason I'm okay forgetting about them. Nightmare BB is in a similar boat unfortunately, I just don't know where I'd fit him in. This is also why I bring up FNAF 4's Halloween edition being non-canon, Because if I'm right, Crying Child likely never would have seen the specific animatronics that would become the Jackos, meaning it wouldn't make sense for him to dream about them. But what about Dreadbear? Well, I have a feeling based on the Phasmoblast minigames that Dreadbear, and possibly Carney, were real animatronics at one point. Dreadbear was likely an MCM creation to parody Fazbear's Fredbear, which would explain why he was present. Dreadbear may have even got away unscathed, as although Carney is charred and destroyed, we never see Dreadbear's remains. Dreadbear was likely even their main attraction, and if that's the case, then Fall Fest itself was likely a Halloween event. Maybe the curse of Dreadbear itself is in reference to the fire, thus why he's joined primarily by the Jacko animatronics in that DLC. That leaves Nightmarion, and I think I'll end up falling back on a modern classic theory. I think Nightmarion may be representative of a dark side of Fazbear Entertainment, as a force of nature that, while not real, does embody everything wrong with the company. The reason it's connected to Halloween is because that's when everything started. The Fall Fest fire, the Halloween fire, that's what sent them down the dark path that would lead to the modern day. Nightmarion as a concept is the sum of Fazbear Entertainment's dark history, which stems from Halloween. That's also why I think they kept making reappearances even when it didn't necessarily make sense, like in Security Breach, Ruin, and Help Wanted 2. They're always there, not necessarily as an actual force, but as a sort of sum-all of the franchise's history. This paints the Halloween edition of FNAF 4 in an especially interesting light that makes sense why it can't be considered canon. None of the Afton children, as far as we know, have any ties to Fall Fest directly, meaning if the player is Michael or Crying Child, it doesn't make sense for them to be confronted by animatronics who they have no real connection to. It also paints the Halloween backstage of FNAF world in an interesting light as well, because as I said before, this is one of the most meta FNAF games ever. In fact, one of Nightmarion's moves, and a move only shared by Animdude, or Scott Cawthon himself, is Fourth Wall, implying that this is a character who exists on a plane of existence beyond the others, and may have an actual hand in crafting the lore of the games that they're in. So to sum up the theory nicely, here it goes. Halloween 1970-something was the last night of Fall Fest for that particular year. Fazbear Entertainment had been in attendance, showing off animatronics created by MCM as part of their partnership. These included Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and their spooky replacement for Freddy, Dreadbear. These characters were meant to tease an upcoming restaurant, however, that isn't what happened. A fire broke out, torching and eliminating Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, although the Dreadbear animatronic was thankfully rescued before it too could be destroyed. Not so lucky was Fiona Murray, Edwin's stand-in for the event, who was killed in the fire, which, if we go off of a previous theory of mine, was likely set by Afton himself. From that day forward, Halloween became something of a curse for Fazbear Entertainment. Also forming that night was a new entity, one who would begin to personify the company's vile history of murder and death, the Nightmarion. These Jacko animatronics weren't anything special, just rumors of ghosts. Maybe a child's drawing of Bonnie on fire gave it some new meaning. Regardless, these animatronics would, for the most part, not really matter. Until Silver Parasol Games got their hands on some of Fazbear's history. They discovered everything about their past, including Fall Fest, although they couldn't necessarily incorporate every little detail in the DLC for their upcoming game. They decided to theme it around Dreadbear, the sole surviving animatronic from that experience, and created new, flaming versions of the other animatronics as a way to keep their stories alive. All the while, Nightmarion persisted, and with the truth of where it comes from being slowly unraveled, it began to plant itself in a physical form everywhere, watching more history unfold still. So, there you have it. Fazbear Entertainment's past is buried deep in the tradition of candy corn and carving pumpkins. Now, do I believe this theory? Not particularly, but hey, it's Halloween, the night where everyone gets to pretend to be something they're not. Whoa, I'm John FNAF, do you need more proof? Just kidding, I'm actually Rytoast, see this cat on my lap? But wait, I'm actually Withered Circle, Green Afton. And in any case, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.